ברשות נשיא המדינה לנהל את המעמד הזה בשפה האנגלית, וזאת בגלל האורחים הרבים מחוץ לארץ הנמצאים איתנו הערב. Your Excellency President Shazar, Your Excellency Madam Prime Minister, Your Excellency the Deputy Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet, Rabbinit Herzog, Pnina Herzog, Chaim Herzog, members of the Herzog family, the President of the Supreme Court, Justice Agranat, Mrs. James Rothschild, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the University, Mr. Rothberg, Your Excellencies, the members of the Diplomatic Corps, Reverend Clergy, Dr. Nachum Goldman, Mayor Kolek, Sir Isaiah Berlin, ladies and gentlemen. A cruel fate has decreed that only a week after the festive proclamation of the commencement of the 25th year of Israel's independence, we should be gathered here for the first Ya'akov Herzog Memorial Lecture. The ceremonies and celebrations of this anniversary year were all planned by him. Indeed, the fact that Israel has attained this stage of its development with its present strength, resilience, and confidence is in no small measure and due to him. The uniqueness of Ya'akov Herzog is reflected in the varied composition of this audience. Among us are his contemporaries and teachers in the first graduating class of this university's Faculty of Law, colleagues who worked with him in the Harry Fischel Institute for Talmudical Research when he was translating tractates of the Mishnah into English with his own original commentaries, friends who labored with him during World War II in the rescue of European Jewry, cabinet ministers who recall the originality, the finesse, the encyclopedic knowledge, and the dedication to objective which marked his collaboration with them in so many areas: diplomatic, financial, defense, and cultural. Men and women who served with him in Jerusalem, Washington, and Ottawa, colleagues who know him from his far-ranging activities in the development of Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. Numerous friends who recall their meetings with him in the Memorial Council for Jewish Education and Culture and the Conference of Jewish Organizations. Lawyers who attended his weekly lessons in Talmud. Scholars who respected his scientific contributions in the field of human rights and Middle East studies. And of all of us, no matter in what capacity we came to know him, his friends and his devotees. How rich and varied, how productive of lasting good, of abiding contributions to our state and our people were these remarkable qualities, all united in a single whole personality at peace with itself. We are joined together here in bereavement to which there is no comfort. It is fitting that arrangements have been made for annual Ya'akov Herzog Memorial Lectures in the various fields of his wide interests to be held in succession at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of London, Columbia University in New York City, and McGill University in Montreal, Canada. In all these countries, he served the cause of our people. It is fitting that the cycle begins here in Jerusalem, where he lived and wrought so nobly. And nothing could be more appropriate than that the first lecture should be given by his friend, Sir Isaiah Berlin, whom he admired so much for his wisdom, his scholarship, and his devotion to Israel and the Jewish people. I now have the honor to call on Sir Isaiah Berlin to deliver the first Ya'akov Herzog Memorial Lecture. He has chosen as his subject Zionist Politics in Wartime Washington, a fragment of personal reminiscence. Sir Isaiah Berlin.
אדוני יושב ראש, כבוד הנשיא, כבוד ראש הממשלה, כבוד סגן ראש הממשלה, הרבנית הרצוג, גברת פנינה הרצוג ובני משפחת הרצוג, גבירותיי ורבותיי, הייתי רוצה לדבר עליכם בשפתנו בעברית, אבל השפה לא שגורה בפי, ולכן אני מצטער מאוד שלא אוכל לעשות את זה. לו, אפילו אם עלה בידי הדבר הזה, בקושי ובייסורים, הרצאה הזו שהיא כבר ארוכה למדי, הייתה נמשכת מי יודע עד מתי. ועל כך אני מתנצל מראש לדבר באנגלית. I must begin by expressing my appreciation for the great honor of being chosen by this university to deliver the first of the series of lectures dedicated to the memory of Dr. Ya'akov Herzog. To inaugurate this series is a unique and tragic privilege, particularly a sad one for me, who, like many of us gathered here, knew him and greatly loved him. The loss of our friend, cut off in his prime, is as bitter a loss to us, who were on terms of warm personal affection with him, as it is to his country and his government, which he served with such deep, selfless and undivided devotion, and with a great breadth of understanding for points of view not his own, which is rare among human beings anywhere. This is not the right occasion for me to pay the appropriate tribute to his extraordinary personal and political qualities, and to his services to Israel and to the Jewish people as a whole. I try to do this, something of this, not very adequately elsewhere. But this I must say, the first lecture in his memory should deal with some central topic in the field of Jewish religion or Jewish learning, which were close to his heart and to his soul. At least something in the history of Judaism conceived in the large and synoptic way in which we used to think about such things. I cannot do this, for I am not qualified to do so. At any rate, not qualified in a manner that would be worthy of the kind of person that Ya'akov Herzog was. Consequently, I hope that I may be forgiven if I talk about a much narrower subject, but one which does at least form part of my own personal experience. I must warn you that this lecture will be unavoidably subjective. It will be innocent of any scholarly research. It will be dependent upon a very imperfect memory. It will be largely autobiographical, and it will deal with facts which I expect will be quite familiar to quite a lot of people here. My only excuse for wandering over this well-trodden ground is that it offers an illustration from the not too common past of a thesis which I often discussed with my friend Ya'akov Herzog. I mean, the complexity of the web of history, the perils when trying to anticipate the immediate future of extrapolating it too mechanically from the present and the recent past, of not allowing sufficiently for the play of the incalculable and the fortuitous, particularly for the influence on public events of individual character, of quirks of individual character, and of individual behavior. And most of all, of the liability, at least in the short run, of these factors to upset perfectly reasonable expectations, to destroy safe and widely held assumptions which often turn out to rest on nothing but shifting sands. We used to discuss, Ya'akov Herzog and I, we used to discuss the relative influence of leaders of different psychological formation. For example, on the one hand, men of inflexible and even fanatical conviction who, intent upon their goal, shut their ears to prudent advice, ignore danger, drive on fearlessly and relentlessly. And, in contrast to these, men of another complexion, men of cautious temper, mature judgment, moderation, instinctive revulsion from overstepping accepted moral bounds, humane men endowed with practical wisdom, men suspicious of heroic attitudes. Shimon bar Giora in contrast with Yochanan ben Zakkai. I need not, to this audience, give illustrations of these types of characters. They will be familiar to all. The situation I propose to try and describe is simply a small corner of wartime Anglo-Zionist American relations with which I was personally acquainted, because it seems to me to illustrate the interplay of just such factors. But first, I must say something about my own qualifications for talking about this kind of thing at all. Almost the whole of my life, since I came of age, has been spent in academic pursuits. Almost, but not entirely. In 1941, I was sent by the British government as a specialist to New York, attached to the new British information services in their day. My specialism, for which I had no kind of preparation, consisted in trying to induce some of the minority groups in the United States, for example, organized labor, the Jewish press, some of the smaller Protestant sects, to include in their publications information about the British war effort and to counter the anti-British or isolationist trends strong among some of them. Catholics, Negroes, and the other hyphenated American press were left to other specialists. My task was not too difficult, since the anti-Nazi sentiment of some of my clients, particularly my Jewish clients, was not in doubt. The Jewish press by this time was openly, solidly, and warmly pro-British. The war did, of course, find the majority of the American Jewish population, especially those of Eastern European origin, in a pro-Zionist mood. It is true that the British White Paper of 1939, which condemned the Yishuv to remain a permanent minority in Arab Palestine, created deep depression and anger in wide sections of the American and indeed the world Jewish community. Nevertheless, the declaration of war, British heroism in 1940, created a vast wave of sympathy and enthusiasm for Britain and America, which for obvious reasons the Jewish community felt most passionately. Despite the anti-immigration measures of the Palestine administration, despite the dreadful fate of the refugee ship Struma, which moved to shame some even in the colonial office, Zionist attacks on the British government virtually died down, save for the campaign for the Jewish army, conducted most vehemently by revisionists and their allies both among Jews and among sincere liberal Gentile sympathizers. The virtual rejection of the plan for the army by the British government towards the end of 1941 was a bitter disappointment to moderates as well as extremists. No one was taken in by the reason officially given in London, that there was insufficient equipment. Political reasons, mainly fear of upsetting the Arabs, were clearly paramount. Nevertheless, unlike the situation in 1914-17, American Jewish support for Britain was almost unanimous. Almost. For there were, of course, Jewish individuals and groups who were nervous of appearing to be warmongers, or of being accused of putting their sectional interests before the national needs, national ends of the United States. Some among these became members of isolationist groups, which contained a handful of prominent and wealthy Jews whose position vis-à-vis the rest of the Jewish community ceased to be embarrassing only after Pearl Harbor. In addition to these, there were small groups of Jewish Marxists who regarded the war as one between two imperialisms, the outcome of which, at least in theory, was a matter of complete moral indifference to dedicated internationalists, save as a force promoting a revolutionary situation. Some of these, though not all, changed their line after the attack on the Soviet Union. My chief mentors in these matters were drawn from very different worlds. One was a very charming and honorable man, a very gifted man too, a Yiddish journalist, the late Judd Teller, who helped me with the Yiddish press. The other, whom I saw only twice, was the famous justice of the Supreme Court, Louis D. Brandeis, then in the last year of his long life. He expounded to me the sociology of the American Jewish community with the great moral charm and lucidity that were characteristic of him. Make no mistake, he said to me, make no mistake. The majority of the Jewish community is with us, that is Zionists. They won't immigrate in any numbers, but they know that they've got to be a majority somewhere, have a country of their own, if they are to hold their heads high among other loyal American citizens of recent European origin. They know that. Some of them are pretty ignorant people, but they will learn and they will support the Palestine experiment with all their might. Unfortunately, the majority haven't much money, and they aren't politically organized in the way the Catholics are. So the influence they will be able to have on American policy may not be great. In fact, I think they won't be able to do much that way. Only contribute what they can and give all their hearts and hopes and fears to the movement, as he called Zionism. It's pretty much like the labor movement in England before the First World War, he said. Only our people may not have the same success. I don't vouch for the verbal accuracy of what I've just repeated, but I did make some notes of it, which I subsequently lost. I made them because Felix Frankfurter wanted to know exactly what Brandeis had said to me. And the fact that I made notes did imprint some of this on my memory. Brandeis went on to add that the money and the influence belonged to the rich and politically prominent among the Jews, some of whom were, in his view, were hopelessly ignorant and prejudiced, but above all, fearful of seeming to attempt to rock the boat of American policy in some Jewish direction. Still, there were some good and brave men among them too. Felix Frankfurter, for example, or Ben Cohen. Henry Morgenthau was a decent, warm-hearted man, in contrast to his vain and narrow father. Even Bernard Baruch could on occasion be a foul-weather friend. However, the run-of-the-mill Zionist propagandists were, in his view, politically appallingly inept. They made a great deal of noise, but they lacked sense, and they were much too generous with other people's time and patience. The majority of them were much more of a liability than an asset to the Zionist cause. Brandeis spoke with deep feeling of the decency of the lower middle class and poor Jews, ill-informed, but with their hearts in the right place, and returned to the contempt which he felt for the behavior of some of the richest and most powerful and most prominent. This was obviously a deeply held conviction. He told me to take no notice of these people. Their very cravenness would immobilize them and put them out of account. He mentioned no names, but anyone who knew the American scene at this time could easily identify some of the heads whom this cap fitted. I've never before or after met anyone who combined such pure and intense moral feeling, such dignity and charm, with so uncompromising and ironical a sense of reality, would cut through all cant and rhetoric, and dealt solely in hard facts, brass tacks, no matter how many or how small. The justice's manner was somewhat impersonal, that of a man engaged in an unswerving pursuit of concrete truth, with little respect for persons. Yet the truth may sometimes have eluded even him. It was to him, I think, that I must, at least in part, impute my mistaken view, or attribute my mistaken view, that the opinions of 5 million American Jews would in the end have little influence on American foreign policy, and that only persons in the Jewish community who might affect it would be eminent individuals, men of standing not unlike himself, on whom he based his principal hopes. It was not perhaps a grave error, for in the end the views of these leaders and of the masses coalesced. But it took some major blunders on the part of the British government, as well as rigid intransigence by pro-Arab officials, both in Britain and in America, to achieve this unanimity. The situation looked very different in 1941 and remained fluid till the end of the war. After that, things altered dramatically in a manner that neither I nor I suspect others had anticipated. Not, I suspect, Dr. Weizmann or those who thought like him, among whom, unofficially, I counted myself at all times. I had a long conversation about this with Mr. Ben-Gurion in 1941. He proved on the whole to be right, and my friends and mentors mistaken, as I hope to explain. In 1942, I was transferred to the British Embassy in Washington. There my job was quite different, that of reporting on the political scene in the United States in general and Washington in particular. My task was, in effect, that of a political observer, a foreign correspondent with one or two differences, that my drafts were liable to be modified or altered by various embassy officials through whose hands they passed, up to and including the ambassador, that they were, in theory at least, confidential, and that my audience consisted entirely of British government officials in London and elsewhere. Zionist activities, so far as I remember, played a very minute part in these reports, for they were marginal to the movement of general American or Washington opinion. Zionists were regarded at the British Embassy as at best embarrassing allies, at worst simply as minor political nuisance. Until Zionist agitation greatly increased in 1943-44, it was not taken too seriously. Not very seriously even then. Zionists were neither encouraged nor parried, even when their attacks on British policy grew in violence. I used to argue about Zionism with anyone who showed the slightest interest. Despite what appeared to me to be cogent reasoning, I fear I made no converts. One of my pre-war American pupils at Oxford, is today, unless he has retired, one of the most fiercely anti-Zionist American officials in the State Department. Nor do my efforts appear to have made the faintest impression on my old friend, Sir Harold Bealey, whom neither I nor Sir Charles Webster were ever able to shift an inch from his notorious convictions on this subject. Dr. Weizmann, whom I first met in 1938, gave shape to my views. His realism, his moderation, and his political genius lifted him above any other statesman I ever knew well. I remained devoted to him to the end of his days and adhere to his principles and outlook to this day. In Washington, he and his immediate followers seemed to me to be at once the most far-sighted and the most effective. The extremists, both of the right and of the left, who, out of bitterness or for temperamental reasons, advocated ruthless policies, I never found congenial. These people seemed to me to put the satisfaction of their own emotional needs above the attainable goals of the cause which they supported. The extremists regarded the moderates as craven. The moderates repaid them by regarding them as lunatics. This is perhaps the situation in every movement that seeks to promote radical change against great odds. I knew where I stood. The politics of the extremists seemed to me the politics of despair at a time when sanity could still prevail. Their goals seemed to me utterly utopian, their methods horrifying, and likely to lead to results which only fanatics could desire. I was and remain an incurably skeptical liberal, a convinced gradualist. The attractiveness to me, therefore, of Dr. Weizmann's outlook was obvious. I had no executive functions in the embassy, and my work there didn't involve me in any kind of Zionist politics. I never spoke of my work to my Zionist friends and acquaintances, and, to do them justice, they never asked me to reveal its nature, though it was not secret, nor did they ask me to give them confidential information. Even Dr. Weizmann, in his most intimate moments, never made the slightest attempt to use me in this way. I was a servant of the British government for the duration of the war, and he didn't wish to embarrass me, nor did Moshe Sharet, nor David Ben-Gurion, nor the other Zionist leaders whom I met quite frequently in the United States. They talked about Palestine and Zionism, of course, and of their hopes and fears. And although each side probably now and then reached the edge of discretion, neither side actually overstepped it. They didn't reveal their secrets, and they didn't expect me to reveal mine. Not that I had very many. I made no effort to conceal my views from my British or American colleagues, and I used to argue for a solution of the Jewish problem on Weizmannite lines with some of my friends in the embassy, in the White House, and in the State Department. They didn't seem the least surprised by such opinions on my part. Indeed, they seemed to them perfectly natural, though frequently they disagreed with them. Like the British ambassador Lord Halifax, they were not much interested in the subject. Like him, they saw it as a movement that occasionally grew troublesome, but was not of ultimate importance in Anglo-American relations. The Foreign Office, I may say, was not exactly a pro-Zionist organization, and had by this time decided to back the Arab horse. But this was not a subject on which total conformity was demanded. So, for example, the late Oliver Harvey, during the war, Mr. Eden's principal private secretary, was consistently pro-Zionist and remained a personal friend of the Weizmanns. And there were 4 or 5 other officials, whose names I could mention, who were mildly sympathetic to Jewish aspirations in Palestine. As for the Department of State in Washington, the officials in charge of Near Eastern affairs were, one and all, solidly hostile to the Zionist cause. Among the other American career officials, no one, so far as I know, positively favored it. Certainly none of my friends among them showed the slightest signs of doing so. They simply thought that Zionism was foolish and utopian in the face of inexpugnable, undilutable Arab hostility. Among the political officials, there was some division. Sumner Wells was considered a friend by the Zionists. Ashton was known to be opposed to it. He never discussed it with his great friend Felix Frankfurter, with whom he used to walk downtown every morning. Adolf Berle was, as in all things, ambivalent. The Secretary of State, Mr. Cordell Hull, appeared to take very little interest in foreign affairs, unless he was compelled to do so, and when he did, followed the President's line. As for the President himself, whether for political or personal reasons, he clearly wished to give the impression, at least to some of his Jewish advisors and visitors, of being favorable to Zionist goals, as indeed 1 or 2 White House officials in fact were. In this regard, there existed, and perhaps still does, a certain difference of attitude, or at least degree of flexibility, between the Department of State and the White House. The executive officials in the British Embassy derived much of their information about American attitudes from their opposite numbers in the Department of State and other American officials with whom they did their business. Hence, Quite understandably, they were at times liable, so I thought, to overestimate the value of impressions obtained from such official sources when they assessed American policy. But as any politician or any journalist could tell, there were plenty of other influences at work, personal and sectional, stemming from lobbies, from pressure groups, as well as plenty of evidences of public feeling. And it was one of my functions to bring these factors to the attention through the embassy of the British government at home. In this web, a strand, though not perhaps a very important one, was the attitude of the great Jewish community of the USA. In 1942, with America at war, Zionist and Zionist-inspired attacks on British policy in Palestine began to grow in frequency and intensity. The refusal to authorize the creation of a Jewish fighting force, the increasingly rigid implementation of the white paper policy by the mandatory authorities in Palestine exacerbated this feeling. I remember, however, a public occasion on which Weizmann, whose son had lost his life while serving with the Royal Air Force, delivered a strong and characteristic protest against this agitation. He said that to denigrate Churchill's Britain at such a moment was not decent. Britain baiting was unworthy of a self-respecting movement. Only an ally, that is the British victory, could save the Zionist cause. This was the cardinal issue. Attacks on Britain must cease. To speak of 200,000 Jewish volunteers for a national Jewish army was, in his opinion, wildly unrealistic, a harmful and dangerous daydream. A badge, a flag, 20,000 men perhaps, was the maximum at present feasible. So long as he was in charge of the movement, there would, he declared, be no breach with Britain. Without her, the movement was doomed. As for the Arabs, he was ready to negotiate with them if they gave tongue. So far, only Jews seem to have spoken on behalf of the Arabs. Let the Arabs speak for themselves. Then we could talk to one another. Lord Moyne had charged him with embarrassing the British government by public criticisms in London. This was a monstrous charge. Nevertheless, to attack Britain in America was odious and counterproductive. One was allowed to attack her in London or in Jerusalem, but not in New York. These forthright sentiments were not well received by Weizmann's audience. He was accused, as so often before and after, of seeing things through British eyes, of Anglomania, of feeble parliamentarism, of appeasement at the expense of the movement. But his prestige was vast and his position was not shaken. I saw a good deal of him at the time and remember well what he thought. His position rested on certain assumptions which at the time few of anyone openly challenged. In the first place, he thought it beyond argument that to win the war against Hitler was a goal that transcended all other considerations. That even if the policies of the Churchill government were unjust or mistaken, no one had the moral right, least of all the Jews, to give comfort to the enemies of that government in the United States or anywhere else at this time. When the war was won, Britain, in his view, and who did not believe this at the time, would surely remain the dominant power in the Middle East. The future of Zionism and of the Jewish settlement, its very survival, were, for better or worse, bound up with England and her goodwill. A final breach would be fatal to Jewish hopes. That this was not impossible, the White Paper had made plain. The Foreign Office had killed the Peel partition plan and would kill Zionism if it could. But the Foreign Office was not everything. The Prime Minister was, after all, Winston Churchill. His sympathy for Zionism was and remained genuine. The movement had influential friends in Parliament and in the Cabinet, especially the War Cabinet, which was not dominated by pro-Arabs or anti-Zionists in the Foreign Office or anywhere else. After all, it consisted of people like Leo Amery, Archibald Sinclair, Duff Cooper, to some degree even Oliver Stanley, Smuts, and the Labour ministers. Attlee's steady anti-Zionism wasn't known about at this time. Bevin's role still lay in the future. To inflame British feeling by irresponsible attacks, to seek disreputable alliances with Britain's critics in America was immoral and insane. So far Weizmann. By this time, Weizmann certainly favored the creation of a Jewish state. His famous article on Foreign Affairs showed this clearly. But he believed that it would need to be closely associated with a great power if it was to survive politically or indeed physically. It depended on such association for its minimum security. Otherwise, it might be overwhelmed by the Arabs and their allies. One couldn't expect America to become this protective power. She would surely not want to assume responsibilities in a region with which she had no traditional ties and would reject any such suggestion as she had done after the First War. Besides, Weizmann didn't really want an American protectorate in place of a British one. American policies were too unstable, open to too many internal pressures. And there were too many anti-Semites in high places in that country. Whom else could he look to? The British might be driven to abandon the Jews. This wasn't at all impossible. But the Jews mustn't let this happen. It spelled suicide. These seem to me to have been among the basic considerations that swayed Weizmann till the end of the war. And besides these, there were more personal ones as well. He did like and admire the British. He liked our combination of courage and moderation. He liked the civilized quality of their domestic politics. He admired this more than the character and life of any other nation. The Jews had more to learn from them than from any other society. Association of the British Empire, despite all the obvious disadvantages and the unhappy marriage in the past, and the frequently painful character of Anglo-Jewish relations, was nevertheless a desirable fate for a politically inexperienced, unruly, stiff-necked people like the Jews. The White Paper was, as its implacable critic Churchill saw it, simply a temporary aberration, a pathetic and desperate step taken in a moment of panic. This unworthy step would be abrogated. The White Paper would pass away. The Jews would obtain a state in Palestine with British help, or not obtain one at all. To scream abuse at England, as some Zionists wished to do, was a luxury which they couldn't begin to afford either morally or politically. Weizmann was a British subject by design. He believed in the British connection. He tells Lord Halifax that he would keep him informed of any formal conversations he might have with American statesmen. The British government repaid him with a kind of reluctant respect, reluctant admiration. It knew that his purposes were those of every Zionist, but his approach and his means and his manner were different and compelled respect. Consequently, British politicians tended to trust him. Some of them took him into their confidence, discussed details of partition plan with him and him alone. As for America, Zionists should of course attempt, in Weizmann's view, to influence her in that direction by every legitimate means, above all by his own conspicuous and successful method of patient diplomacy, by persuading influential persons in the administration and the legislature. Marches, petitions, resolutions, advertisements in the press with signatures of prominent persons, fiery philippics, all this might impress the Jews. It would not succeed in moving Washington. Weizmann believed this, I feel sure, throughout the war. It divided him from conservatives like Abba Hillel Silva and from revisionists and their proto-Irgun allies. And it was far too soft a line for the militants in other Zionist groups. But he was Weizmann. He was recognized as the greatest Jewish personality of his time, and little could be done with him. He stuck to his guns, not to alienate Churchill and the pro-Zionists in the British cabinet, to talk and talk again to responsible people. This is how the Balfour Declaration has been secured. Weizmann's experience and temperament, his moral and political beliefs, made this the only way in which he personally could function. His collaborators supported him in this. Nachum Goldman stood by him loyally and ably, so did Louis Lipsky. Meyer Weisgall did much drafting for him and acted as his ambassador to various Zionist groups. Even Stephen Wise restrained his natural exuberance out of respect for the great leader. I must admit that Weizmann's arguments seemed to me at the time unanswerable. To win the war was obviously the supreme common goal. To sow dissension among the Allies was foolish and wrong. The case of the Jews, despite everything, was bound up with that of Britain. Churchill and Roosevelt would surely not, once the war was over, sell out the Jewish national cause. America, anyway, was not a possible substitute for Britain. Extremist tactics, violent agitation, impossible demands were irresponsible, and with Hitler at the gates, mad and self-defeating. As for Jewish opinion in the United States, even if it was far better politically organized and wholeheartedly favorable to a Jewish state in Palestine than in fact it was, it could surely not achieve as much as key figures in Washington could effect. Roosevelt was the idol of the great majority of Jewish voters. Votes mattered in election years, in 1944 for example, but they weren't enough by themselves to determine major U.S. policies, as was shown by the disregard of, say, Polish or Bohemian feelings in 1940. It was doubtful whether the Zionist cause could be made to affect American public opinion in the way, say, that of India, or at an earlier date, Ireland had done. Thus far, and I'm speaking only of 1942-43, the critics and enemies of Britain had not made use of the Zionist stick to beat the British with. Weizmann was surely right. Only in Erfüllungspolitik, only gradualism was the proper hope for a movement which had considerably fewer battalions than even the Pope. Politically influential American Jews who stood outside the Zionist movement but helped it from time to time. Morgenthau, Frankfurter, Ben Cohen, Herbert Lehman, George Rosenman were of the same mind. It was this, and not craven feeling, or fear of the spectre of double allegiance, that caused such men to wince when the more unbridled Zionist leaders embarrassed the American administration by excessive zeal, or disregard for the truth, or by breaking the rules of politically decent conduct. Pro-Zionist American Jewish officials felt this very strongly. I remember well what their feelings were when the notorious March of Rabbis took place in Washington in, I think, 1943. It was not Mr. Roosevelt only who was moved to absolute fury by such antics. On the evidence of the years 42, 43, 44, this seems to me even now to have been the valid position. The events which later transformed the situation and put Weizmann out of power was still in the unknown and, I believe, unknowable future. There is, however, no doubt that in the light of these later events, the assumptions we all made and the deductions that we drew from them did prove mistaken, and that there was a certain sense in which Weizmann was wrong and Ben-Gurion nearer understanding the forces at play. About this I intend to say something. I had a long and fascinating conversation with Ben-Gurion on a Sunday in October 1941. So long and so fascinating that when we rose from lunch, it was well after 5 p.m. And it was only then that I learned from the cab driver that the news of Pearl Harbor had been announced some hours previously. I kept no note of conversations with eminent Jewish leaders from Palestine, either David Ben-Gurion or Moshe Sharet or Eliyahu Alat or anybody else. I must rely only on my very uncertain memory. Ben-Gurion too seemed to me to believe in the British connection, both as inevitable and as desirable. But he sharply dissented from Weizmann in several respects. Despite his immense admiration for Churchill, not so much on account of his pro-Zionism, but as a man of supreme courage who, like Tito and de Gaulle, stood up and fought against enormous odds, he put no faith in princes, neither Churchill, nor Roosevelt, nor any other Gentile leader or party or country. He believed the Jews of Palestine would by themselves be able to repel unavoidable Arab attack, at least for a time. And he put great faith in the support of the Jews of America. The Jewish masses, not the leaders who were, in his view, men of little faith or character. The masses, fired by the image of an independent state, would prove far stouter-hearted and more effective allies than the powerful politicians whom Weizmann might persuade or charm. When Ben-Gurion spoke in this vein, in short, sharp bursts, punctuated by even more intense, absorbed, brooding silences, it was as if the apocalyptic vision by which he was possessed outran his powers of expression. Jewish opinion must be mobilized everywhere, and particularly in the United States. That alone would help. If it came to a crisis, the Jewish settlement in Palestine would know how to stand up for itself, as the British did in 1940. Diplomacy, Weizmann's patient appeals to history and to reason, was an obsolescent weapon. The statesmen of the world listened but did nothing. I tried to argue with him. American Jews, even non-Zionists, favored immigration to Palestine, both from ideal motives and, whether consciously or not, as a self-protective measure. They knew that Congress would never dream of opening American gates to Jewish refugees. It wasn't cowardice, it was mere realism, they thought, not to demand this. But to demand a Jewish state, how much support could this muster? The number of committed American Zionists was a minority of the Jewish population. If the American government, and especially Roosevelt, declared, as he might easily do, that it wasn't in the national interest of America to quarrel for the sake of Jewish national aspirations with England or with the Arabs or both, that Zionist pressure was an embarrassment to the foreign policy of the United States, would these Jews not recoil from the prospect of being thought to obstruct the policies of our government, particularly of the great president, for whom many of them felt profound admiration and in some cases deep personal loyalty? Ben-Gurion waved all this away. Let Weizmann go on courting Roosevelt and Sumner Wells. In the end, such men, even such proven friends as Churchill, Smuts and Amory and the rest, would inevitably pursue the national interests of their countries. They wouldn't be ready to help the Jews through thick and thin. Through thin, perhaps. Through thick, never. Only the Jews themselves, only their mass strength in the USA and Palestine would stand up. In the end, it was on them alone that the movement could count. I argued that the American Zionists vastly overestimated the power of the American Jewish population to influence the foreign policy of the United States. To rely on this and to fail was to cause disaster that might set the entire movement back for a generation. So we argued in circles. On the evidence of the war years, my thesis doesn't seem to me to be unreasonable even now. It proved mistaken. Ben-Gurion's faith in the masses proved justified. But the turn of events which altered the situation was still invisible, at least to me. I now knew Ben-Gurion's mind. The Biltmore Resolution of 1942 became a rallying cry for Jewish feeling and proved to be the first great step in the mounting ascendancy of Zionism over American Jewish opinion, culminating in the American Jewish Conference, of which Weizmann was the principal architect. The Biltmore program was variously interpreted and attacked only by small anti-Zionist groups. Ben-Gurion's maximalist interpretation of it seemed to me utopian. In the event, his passionate faith proved to be politically justified. At the time, it looked almost as unrealistic as Theodor Herzl's visionary words more than 40 years before. In the meanwhile, the defeat of Rommel in North Africa seemed to put Palestine out of immediate danger. In 1943, the Allies were advancing. Britain was no longer beleaguered. Attacks on British policy by American Zionists increased in intensity. The British authorities were increasingly irritated by the mounting stream of denunciation at Zionist banquets, in newspaper advertisements, and in resolutions passed by various humanitarian and political associations. So with the deeply anti-Zionist, not to say anti-Jewish, Near Eastern section of the State Department, which argued that sooner or later this would upset the Arabs to the detriment of the Allied war effort and of the policy of American-Arab friendship. There was an attempt to damp down the public expression of Zionist views by a joint statement, to be signed indeed by the Prime Minister and the President, declaring that the settlement of the Middle East must wait till the end of the war, and that until then, political demands could only inflame an already uneasy situation. In short, the Zionists must pipe down. But in the meanwhile, there had taken place for some time a great rise in the pro-Zionist sentiment on the part of prominent Jewish personalities in Washington. Whatever their ideas about the Jewish state, they were united in opposition to the White Paper and in the desire for an enlarged Jewish immigration into Palestine, which both Jews and Arabs knew to be the nub of the problem. The plan to issue a statement on these lines became known to some of them and was killed by them, to the extreme annoyance of some British and American officials. I remember that I tried to convey to my superiors at the embassy that the Zionist movement was making friends and was influencing persons in official Washington. There was mounting sympathy with the Zionist ideas in the upper ranks of the American government, whatever the relevant officials of the State Department might feel or say. Some among the old New Dealers in the administration had had their imaginations fired by the idea that 1 million Jewish immigrants, backed by adequate capital, armed with energy and skills, could, by applying the methods whereby marshes had been drained in Palestine and arid land made to flourish, transform the entire Middle East, both socially and economically. Bold, well-conceived, large-scale plans, of which the harnessing of the waters of the Jordan, hydroponics, development of the Negev were potential examples, could lead to vast irrigation, electrification, reforestation schemes. New industries would spring up, which would create a new and better life for all the peoples of the region. That's one set of allies. On a more personal level, Sumner Welles gave his Zionist visitors the impression that he sympathized with them, their political aims. So did Titinius, who might be something of a lightweight, but probably reflected the liberal and increasingly generous attitude to the Jewish question in ruling circles in America. Weizmann felt this too. He made it plain over and over again that he was ready to talk to Arabs if Anglo-American diplomacy paved the way, and if it were made plain that minimum Jewish claims were beyond discussion. He thought that even Saud might be ready to help. This proved a total delusion, and that the Arabs would be ready for some rational compromise if they didn't feel that Britain was so strongly on their side. By this time, Weizmann must have known something of the scheme for a new partition of Palestine that was being discussed by a British cabinet committee. He asked me, I remember, what I thought of the likelihood of the abrogation of the White Paper. Unlike Weizmann, I had not then heard anything of ideas on partition which he did not reveal to me. And I answered that I saw no sign of change in the Palestine policy of the government. Weizmann evidently didn't believe much in the cabinet conversations at that time, for in the middle of 43 he seemed depressed and frustrated. He gave me the impression of feeling impotent so long as the McMichael administration remained in charge. Relations between the British and the Jews in Palestine, in his view, were becoming more tense and more unfriendly than at any period in the past. He had had his differences with Herbert Samuel 20 years before, but now he tied up that time as a girl's maid. I received a far more sanguine impression of Zionist progress from my friend Dr. Nachum Gulzer, of whom I thought something at this time, and I tried to convey some of this to my colleagues in the light of what that civilized and sagacious man would tell me from time to time about Zionist hopes and attitudes. He revealed no secrets, but his tour d'horizon used to fascinate me. He was at this time one of the representatives of the Jewish agency in Washington, and used to see 2 or 3 embassy officials besides myself. His friendliness, his ebullience, his good nature, as well as his Weizmannite views, contrasted very favorably in their eyes with the thunder and lightning of the formidable Dr. Silva of Cleveland, whom they didn't know personally, but who occasionally sought interviews with Lord Halifax. I too was entranced both by the content and the exhilarating quality of Dr. Goldman's exposition, and suspect that his tone proved irresistibly infectious to me. I remember my efforts to convey to my colleagues the sharp contrast between the buoyant mood of even the most moderate of Zionists, of this most moderate of Zionists, Dr. Goldman, I mean, who, like his collaborators, met with encouragement in Washington, and the stonewalling tactics of the British government, which all of us in the embassy were obliged to reflect and the diplomatic mission to implement. This seemed to me to be based on a continuing lack of attention to the realities of the situation. The Zionists knew perfectly well that however little satisfaction they got from the Foreign Office or the embassy, they had a staunch friend in Churchill. He mightn't be able to do much while all his energy and thought were directed to winning the war, but he made no secret of his views. There were always stories which used to reach us from time to time how, when taxed by some shocked cabinet minister with expressing pro-Zionist sentiments to some visitor, say to Jan Masaryk or to Smuts or even to Weizmann himself, he would of course formally deny the charge of talking indiscreetly, and then add characteristically, I didn't say it, and he's got no right to repeat it. He's not authorized to repeat anything of the kind, but it is exactly what I think. So too, President Roosevelt, one gathered, had said to Eugene Meyer, the greatly respected Republican elder statesman and publisher of the Washington Post, that Churchill was still as much as ever against the white paper. And so indeed was he, Roosevelt. He wished the Jews would trust him a little more. He'd see them through and get the Arabs to make it up with them after the war. The Foreign Office might scoff at the idea, but Zionists believed that Churchill would not permit a scheme accepted by the Cabinet and Parliament to be sabotaged again as the Peel plan had been. My colleagues, despite occasional efforts on my part to bring these facts to their notice, at least in conversation, couldn't bring themselves to consider the issue as one of more than purely peripheral interest. And indeed, in the context of other great events, perhaps it didn't appear to be more than that. What the, on the whole, deeply anti-Zionist Foreign Office thought of it all, I have no notion. They seem to be mainly concerned, as all foreign offices always are in every country, with lowering temperatures, avoiding awkward issues, waiting for cabinet decisions that don't come, and in the meantime, preventing indiscretions, or if they do not succeed in doing this, trying to dissipate their consequences. Inevitably, there were differences between Zionists. Weizmann and Charette didn't always see eye to eye with Ben-Gurion, and the relations were at times pretty strained. Wise and Goldman didn't like it when Silva would visit Lord Halifax and not tell them of what had passed. Anyone who knew Lord Halifax could be sure that nothing of the slightest importance could have taken place on a topic that he regarded as at once so unimportant and so unsafe. Charette used to complain bitterly of the apathy of the majority of the American Jews. Despite the professions of their official representatives, he thought that Zionism had not really made a sufficient impact upon them. They seemed totally unaware, in his view, of the plots against them meditated by their enemies among British or American officials. My colleagues seemed to me to pay no attention to the increasing sympathy with Zionist aims in 43-44 on the part of leading personalities both in Washington and elsewhere. The pro-Arab faction in the administration was by no means having it all its own way. Wells, Stettinius, Wynant, who was ambassador in London, perhaps, so it was said without the slightest evidence, even the President's intimate advisor Harry Hopkins looked with disfavor on the views and activities of the Arabisant officers of the State Department, such as Wallace Murray and those of like mind. The pro-Zionist and anti-white paper speeches or resolutions of senators and congressmen and other well-known persons might not amount to much in concrete terms, but even if they were mere expressions of goodwill and no more, tended to inhibit American officials from going too far, for fear of being attacked by name, by Congressman Teller or someone like that, by name in Congress or in the press. There were pro-Zionist pointers in London also. Had not Weizmann been told by Churchill himself that he would presently, I quote, extract a real plum out of the Palestine pie for him, with which Ashley, who had been present at this meeting, had not disagreed, although he did complain of excessive Jewish pressure in America. Wasn't Amory said to have confirmed to Weizmann that a new partition scheme was ripe, a new partition scheme far more acceptable to the Jews than the Peel proposals, and this would soon be offered to them by the cabinet, and so on. It was true that Zionist agitation, particularly when stimulated by irresponsible extremists from abroad, some of them from Palestine, was said to irritate President Roosevelt greatly, particularly when they mobilized his Republican opponents against the policies of his administration. Moreover, even friendly figures like Stettinius seemed to share the conviction of the British military authorities that pro-Zionist resolutions in the United States could have a dangerously upsetting effect on the Arabs. Indeed, Rabbi Silver made it known that Stettinius had told him to hold his horses at least until the Allied invasion of Europe had begun. Still, this was only a question of when these horses would be allowed to gallop, not whether they would. These rumors, even if they were taken with more than one pinch of salt, and the estimates based on them, even if they sprang from over-optimism on the part of the more sanguine Zionist leaders, nevertheless indicated real diplomatic progress on their part. Palestine was not, however, in the forefront of attention. It was no use treating such rumors as being more than what they were. My job was to describe the entire American public scene and keep things in their due proportions. I found it only too tempting in dealing with Washington politics to adopt at times a somewhat satirical and irreverent, and on occasion slightly flippant tone, particularly in dealing with personalities. I found that this style was well received by all but the most solemn and humorless among my superiors. Nevertheless, the substance remained serious, and I interpreted my duties strictly. Dr. Weizmann, throughout 1943-44, became more and more critical of the shrillness of Zionist propaganda in the United States. The mounting sound and fury of the rhetoric of Drs. Wise and Silver, particularly the latter, representing the Democratic and Republican interests respectively, seemed to him only to make his task of pressure and persuasion in London more difficult, without any corresponding advantage. It irritated even the friends of Zionism in England and had not the slightest effect on their policies. Like Moshe Sharet, he noted with concern that these tactics had little effect on general public opinion in the United States, which, despite the writings of pro-Zionist journalists like Edgar Ansel Maurer or Dorothy Thompson at that time, and counterblasts from critics and opponents of the movement in the New York Times or the Reader's Digest, remained entirely uninterested in the Zionist issue. All that the Zionist agitation did was to widen the gulf between Britain and the Jews, and this seemed to Weizmann a dangerous and indeed a fatal trend. I remember a conversation with Rabbi Silver about this. I asked him whether he didn't think that these assaults on British policy were not counterproductive. What was the use of attacks violent enough to exasperate one's opponent without, however, deflecting him from his policy? What was the use of ineffective sanctions? Did he think that Mr. Roosevelt would be as friendly if he was re-elected to a fourth term in 1944 as he now seemed to be? I cannot recollect what, if anything, Dr. Silver answered. I suspect that he was mainly concerned with preserving the momentum of American Zionism. Relations with Britain he left to others. Britain would doubtless follow her own national interests. Hard words broke no bones, particularly in so subtle and resistant an organism. About this I agreed, as so often with Weizmann. American Zionists had little to fear from the anti-Zionist faction in America, a collection of feeble mice trying to bell the huge Zionist cat. But if the American government made it plain that they were not prepared to quarrel with Britain over the Jewish issue, would the majority of American Jews really be ready to come out openly against their government? I remained skeptical. It seemed to me that unlike India, or at an earlier time Ireland, the question of Palestine did not begin to be a key issue in U.S. politics. Some attributed this to the incurable timidity of influential Jewish groups, some to the countervailing force of widespread American anti-Semitism, some to the interest in preserving Arab goodwill on the part of big oil concerns and other big business enterprises with a stake in the Middle East. Some to the fear that if America intervened in that part of the world, it would be expected, indeed it might find itself compelled, to send troops to implement policies against Arab opposition, something that no American could favor. Whatever the explanation, this seemed to me to be a fact. Early in 1944, I became convinced that Silver, Newman, and other Zionist leaders greatly overrated Jewish and more specifically Zionist political influence in the United States. One could get political and religious leaders and well-known liberals to sign letters and petitions, sponsor resolutions, speak at public gatherings, and in this way do something to inhibit open expressions of anti-Zionism. But this was the limit of the effectiveness of this activity. There were few political polls in those days, but press surveys, reports by British consular and other officials, travelers' tales, senators freely express views about sentiment in our states, General Washington talk, seemed to me in 1944 to show that despite some appearances to the contrary, public opinion in America was by and large little concerned with the Zionist issue. It seemed clear to me that so far as general American reactions went, the Foreign Office had little to fear. Opinion within the Jewish community was of course an entirely different matter. I still believe that this impression was not inaccurate, so far as the situation during the war was concerned, although some of the implications of this view turned out in the end to be misleading. At any rate, I was convinced of its validity and said so, in and out of season, in private and in public, to Jews and Gentiles, Zionists and non-Zionists, then and later. I was in London in the early summer of 1944, when a series of anti-British attacks, indeed a steady campaign of vituperation, was being mounted in a good many Zionist organs in the United States. This was faithfully reported by the British press service, and probably some British correspondents as well, and caused a good deal of irritation in government departments in London. Not so much as those concerned with the Middle East, which was hopeless anyway, but as those which dealt with Anglo-American relations. Liberal-minded and by no means anti-Zionist officials were laboring under a sense of outrage. If any war could be just, they argued, if any war could be just, surely this was the most justified of all wars. The stake of the Jews in Allied victory was literally a vital one. Bad blood between the Allies could only harm the common cause, perhaps delay the rate of victory. Besides, some of the charges made by the Zionists were deeply insulting. Americans in London, officials and journalists, offered encouragement and concrete help if the British decided to initiate a counter-offensive in the American press and radio. Mere self-defense would, they were assured by their American friends, not prove effective. They were somewhat hesitant before engaging in open warfare with the Jews of America. Yet, the offer was a tempting one. There were American observers in the Middle East who reported the Jewish Palestine had become a militarized, almost totalitarian camp. There were American journalists and officials, particularly in Cairo, who had espoused the Arab cause and saw the Jews as a disruptive factor in that region. These men sympathized with the difficulties of the mandatory government and should surely be encouraged to counter what could only be described as an anti-British Zionist offensive. Surely there were also might there not be anti-Zionists even among the American Jews, and would these people not perhaps sympathize with such a move? What did I think? I perfectly understood the feelings of decent and patriotic Englishmen, some of whom I knew to be as deeply ashamed of the white paper as they had been of Munich, who thought that the Jews should be the last persons to denigrate England while she was fighting for her life and for their lives too. As for the Zionists, but for England, their cause would lack all political reality. No matter how much they hated the white paper, how could they, I was constantly asked, how could they bring themselves to say the things they did when but for England, Palestine would have fallen prey to the Nazis? I remember explaining as patiently as I could that so far as public opinion of the United States was concerned, it took far less interest in Palestine than in India, or the Far East, or imperialism, or the class structure of Britain, or the future shape of Europe. A concerted anti-Zionist campaign would serve no British purpose. Non-Jewish opinion didn't need it. As for the Jews, so long as the white paper remained in force, the vast majority of American Jews would remain implacably opposed to British policy in Palestine. Whatever their individual views of the Jewish state, however they conceived it, on the issue of immigration, they were virtually united and would remain so, whatever the press or radio might say. So long as the Palestine policy remained unaltered, the political chasm between them and Britain would be unbridgeable. Even non-Zionist Jews were not prepared to go against the pro-Zionist current, if only for fear of appearing, and indeed of being, heartless and disloyal. On the immigration issue, quite apart from protective self-interest, the great majority of American Jews gave free vent to their deep and genuine Jewish feelings. Some might indeed be worried by reports by American journalists who spoke of the grimly disciplined organization of the Jewish Yishuv, of the forming of secret armies to be used against the British and so on. But passionate opposition to the entire white paper policy animated all Jews. If the British government persisted in its attitude, it could expect no lowering of temperature among the vast majority of articulate American Jews. If the government's plan was to create a Palestinian state with a permanent Arab majority, it could defend it in America only by sending emissaries, British or Arab, or whoever it might be, to plead the anti-Zionist cause. But its quarrel with the Jews, all but the most stubborn anti-Zionists, who were a negligible group, would be total. If, however, it contemplated some change in the pro-Zionist direction, as rumors in London and elsewhere kept suggesting, and if it wanted American support for this, then it had a task to perform. General American opinion might be neutral, but there were eminent Jewish personalities of great standing, with much influence, particularly in Washington, and more especially from the White House and Congress. If the new scheme were at all equitable and met the minimum Zionist requirements, these persons could be of great help in preventing an open breach with American Zionists. If the British government launched this new scheme without preparing the ground in Washington, then American Zionists might feel bound to oppose it since it didn't meet their official program, much as they opposed the Peel Plan in 36-37. Then there was a real danger that the scheme, which might after all satisfy basic Zionist needs, might nevertheless go down in a terrible shambles of mutual recrimination. The Jews might well lose more than the British, but both sides would suffer greatly and needlessly. But if the plan was of such a kind that men of stature, such as the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, Justice Frankfurter, Governor Lehman, Benjamin Cohen, who helped to draft the original Palestine Mandate, and other highly placed and honorable Jews could be informally consulted and were prepared to approve such a plan, then the Jewish, or indeed the moderate section of Zionist opinion, which felt respect for these persons, with whom Weizmann was in very regular contact, and who accepted his position, could at least consider the new scheme with initial sympathy. The kind of people whom I mentioned appear to me to enjoy much more influence at the White House and Congress and in the cabinet, and among a good many of those who molded American opinion, than did Zionist or pro-Zionist organizations up and down the country. If these people could be brought into the picture, there might be a possibility of arriving at a solution acceptable to the moderates. Then only the most extreme and intransigent Zionists and anti-Zionists would be left isolated. This would avert a destructive collision between Britain and the Jews, would allay the increasing annoyance and indignation in London, since Britain and the Jews were destined willy-nilly to march together in Palestine, this was the old Weizmannite thesis, would surely make this complicated and sometimes agonizing process somewhat easier. Such developments seem to me to be in the best interest of both Britain and Zionism. To rely on the Jewish battalions in the United States, or anywhere else, to establish a sovereign Jewish state in the whole of Palestine by developing a degree of pressure that would cause the American government to overcome British opposition to this seemed to me to be indulged in a dangerous delusion. Meanwhile, agitation continued. I stuck to my guns. Mere pressure on the American government without any attempt at negotiation with men who had some sympathy with Zionist aims and understanding of the Jewish predicament would surely end in frustration. Attempts to pass pro-Zionist resolutions in the Senate would, if they had real teeth, be blocked by President Roosevelt's administration. This indeed proved to be the case, when towards the end of 1944, General Marshall and Secretary of State Hull killed a strongly pro-Zionist resolution in Congress. The Zionist Organization of America had received a sharp rebuff, which exposed the ineffectiveness of its traditional tactics. A return to Weizmann and patient negotiation seemed to me the only constructive alternative. I don't wish to give the impression that I played any part in Anglo-Zionist relations at this or any other period. I didn't. But I did occasionally meet politicians, administrators, government advisors, and they sometimes talked to me about the Palestine problem. Such very different men as Lord Cranborne and Sir Stafford Cripps, Leo Amery and Maynard Keynes, Sir William Battershill, then in the Colonial Office, and Lord Jowett, who was in charge of post-war planning, all wondered whether if the white paper was modified, only Amery actually talked about abrogation. If the white paper was modified, the new version might not be rejected by both Arabs and Jews. And if so, whether the new policy might not fare worse than the old. If Weizmann accepted it, would the American so-called extremists overthrow him? I could give no clear answer to this. I would stress Weizmann's unique ascendancy in the entire Jewish world, and especially America, and thought that if he was offered something that he could honorably consider, this would at least form a basis for discussion which didn't exist at present, and in which his influence might prevail. They must hope for the best, but I would make it clear that I was a British official and not in the councils of the Zionist movement. If they meant business, they must approach or get someone else, say a British Jew, some standing and respected by Zionists, to approach men like Morgenthau and Frankfurter, who were both sympathetic to Zionism and genuinely Anglophile. Their judgment would be of value. My suggestions were not, so far as I know, taken up by anyone. Things went on, or failed to go on, as before. These conversations and thoughts were based on assumptions on my part some of which were objective and shared by many others, while others were more clearly subjective. I'd like to say something about both. Let me begin with an attempt to recapture my own state of mind at this time, avoiding, so far as I am able, the distorting influence of hindsight. Natural loyalty to England certainly played its part in my attitude, and would have done so, without question, even if I had not been a government servant. Moreover, the end of the war overrode all other considerations. The White Paper was an iniquitous document, and led to acts of brutal inhumanity. Few Druze doubted this. Neither reasons of state nor pro-Arab sentiment could justify this unilateral abandonment of the mandate, which seemed to put out the last rays of hope of the homeless Jewish masses in their hour of mortal danger. I couldn't expect my colleagues, however generous and humane, to understand fully the bitterness of Jewish despair before the apparent indifference of the world to a mass murder carried on a scale too terrible to be believed. In the face of this, the zeal with which the Palestine administration applied the White Paper anti-immigration policy seemed monstrous. Nevertheless, it was Britain who had alone stood up to Hitler in 1940. She and she alone had saved our lives. Her cause was just. Her war was the war of the entire human race against the worst enemy it had ever known. Whatever her shortcomings, and her Palestine policy was perhaps a surrender to expediency, she surely didn't deserve the ceaseless vituperation poured out against her by exasperated American Jews. The steady campaign of denigration conducted by my fellow Zionists seemed to me, on the whole, both irresponsible and counterproductive, and likely to breed only anger and the acts of folly which spring from anger. I mention these subjective feelings only because I have no doubt they probably deeply colored my assessment of the situation. I don't want to claim to be a model of dispassionate objectivity. Yet, even if subjective relations can do something to account for this or that prognosis or policy, it is objective assessments in the assumptions made by Weizmann and his followers, which I accepted, that alone can justify them. Let me again remind you of what they were. First, that England would remain the dominant power in the Middle East, if only because France was prostrate and its rule discredited, while America, whatever its economic ambitions, wouldn't be ready to take over political, still less military responsibilities in the region which lay so far from her traditional sphere of influence. The Soviet Union was, of course, not to be thought of. Consequently, the future of the Jewish settlement in Palestine and a fortiori of any viable Jewish state was bound up with that of Britain. Ben-Gurion accepted this no less than Weizmann. So, for that matter, had Jabotinsky. Secondly, that the British connection was not only inevitable but also desirable. The physical security of the Jewish settlement, still more of the Jewish state, or Commonwealth, as the American Zionists prefer to call it, would plainly need protection against its Arab neighbors, who could scarcely, in view of past history, be expected to look with favor on its creation. And it would require political and economic aid far beyond what it could itself, even with the aid of the Zionist movement, be expected to supply. Moreover, Weizmann and those who agreed with him wished to believe that bygones could become bygones, that Britain had and would continue to exercise a politically civilizing influence on a community not notable for calm judgment or political wisdom or avoidance of bitter party strife, and that despite the difficult and at times profoundly unhappy relationship between Jews and English in Palestine between the two wars, their cooperation was essential both in the imperial interest of Britain and for the national survival of the Jews. True, officials of the Colonial Office and of the Foreign Office tended to look on the Jews in Palestine as aggressively self-assertive, shrill, touchy, neurotic, cliquish, devious, ill-mannered, ungrateful, contemptuous of their Arab neighbors, unutterably tiresome, and impossibly exhausting to deal with. The Jews in their turn looked on the British as their British governors, arrogant, remote, snobbish, pompous, oppressed by guilt about the injustice which they mistakenly supposed their policy did to the Arabs, whom they openly favored, and regarding them as the helpless victims of the wicked Jews whom they viewed with unconcealed distaste. This accounted for the fact, which caused deep bitterness among the Jews, that whenever the Arabs in Palestine made murderous attacks upon the Jews, the mandatory administration always rewarded the Arab aggressors with concessions, and punished the victims, it seemed, simply because they were Jews. The White Paper seemed the natural culmination of this policy. These reciprocal stereotypes didn't seem to hold out much promise for fruitful collaboration in the future. Yet notwithstanding all this, the alliance must go on. For there was no real alternative. Beggars couldn't be choosers, and the advantages in Weizmann's view of the British connection, indeed the absence of alternatives to it, made it the indispensable basis of the Zionist movement. It is my belief that Ben-Gurion accepted this too, though possibly with a good deal less enthusiasm. Thirdly, it was supposed virtually by everyone during the war, and not least by Stalin, that Mr. Churchill would continue his glorious Periclean rule, if not forever, at any rate for some time after the end of hostilities. He was the most powerful and faithful friend of Zionism to be found anywhere. Under him, the Jews would at last obtain a national home. The foreign office would resist, but cabinet and parliament were fair-minded, not unfriendly, more reliable than Congress or Mr. Roosevelt. Fourthly, it was assumed, at least by the Weizmannites, that patient diplomacy alone would yield results, as it had in the past. The mobilization of the Jewish masses, however successful, could only be an aid to, never a substitute for, negotiation. For such collective pressure could never be influential enough to sway America, let alone Britain, from their traditional objectives. The American Jewish vote, however well organized, even if it was supported by humanitarian feeling on the part of the liberal-minded, could never by itself prevail against the oil interests and other big business lobbies. Without government support, the Zionist movement might go on and even gain strength, but it could scarcely become powerful enough to attain even its minimum goals. The possibility of using violence, of terrorist methods, had not then, so far as I knew at the time, entered the thoughts of the Zionist leadership. I believe these to have been the principal objective premises on which Weizmann built his policies. These assumptions were disputed both from the right and from the left, and the last was not fully accepted by Mr. Ben-Gurion. But the moderate center of the Zionist movement, especially outside America, felt, not unjustifiably, that its outlook embodied a very widely accepted view of political reality, and therefore only on such foundations could a structure be built that would provide a just and lasting political solution of the ancient Jewish problem. Although I thought about Zionist affairs a good deal, it occupied a very small portion of my official horizon. I was occasionally asked by Zionist friends how long the white paper policy could go on. I was not optimistic. Alternatively, British officials would wonder how strong American Zionism really was. I would say it was more influential in official circles in Washington than the State Department liked or wanted to believe, and that it was the only positive force in Jewish opinion and had come to dominate it completely. In this way, I managed to depress both sets of inquirers. To my colleagues, British and American, very few of whom took the faintest interest in Jewish affairs, I must have appeared, I think, to be what indeed I was. A moderate Weizmannite, a convinced believer in the Anglo-Zionist connection. To American Zionists, at least to the fiercer among them, I must have seemed a compromiser, a British official concerned to defend his government against hostile attacks, foolishly convinced that a total Anglo-Zionist breach would ruin the Zionist cause, that a solution that would give the Jews self-government, including wide possibilities of immigration, even if it fell short of complete sovereignty, was preferable to head-on collision. This too did not misrepresent my position. I spoke in these terms to most of my friends among Zionist leaders. I don't think that they thought me utterly mistaken. Silver did disagree. He believed in confrontation, in forcing the American government to resist Britain, not merely on the white paper, but on and on, until the Jewish state and the whole of Western Palestine came to being. I believe this to be suicidal zealotry. Masada was not a victory. Within the next 2 or 3 years, the assumptions on which these beliefs, particularly the belief in the special relationship with Britain, rested, were totally blown away by events. How far the roots of what occurred had been discerned by sharper eyes than mine, I do not know. It took a dramatically rapid transformation of the historical scene, and one which, so far as I can tell, no one had foretold or even foreseen, to make the ideas of those who, like Weizmann and his followers, hoped for survival of the British connection seem obsolete and irrelevant. But even now, after all that has happened, I should maintain that though our prognosis was falsified by events, the policy founded upon it was correct, and its more vehement critics mistaken. If Weizmann had lent himself to a policy likely to lead to an open rupture with Britain, this could, I believe, have caused an unavoidable conflict with the Americans too. The price the Zionist movement would in that event have had to pay in post-war years might have been very heavy indeed. It was a relatively unaggressive line taken by Wise and Goldman with Weizmannite encouragement vis-à-vis the American government, particularly in 43-46, that paved the way for President Truman's policies. Weizmann paid a very heavy personal price for his faith in the British, for on this issue he lost his undisputed leadership, but he saved the movement. Without him and his policy, a trial of strength before circumstances made it inevitable might have done irremediable damage to the Jewish cause. Weizmann had his hour as Ben-Gurion had his. Neither was dispensable. Without Weizmann's policies during the war, the state of Israel could scarcely have come into existence. His position in 44, which I fully shared, seems to me even now, after 3 decades, to have been both honorable and right. But let me return to the events which altered everything. Late in 1944, Lord Moyne was assassinated in Egypt by members of the Lehi organization. He was an old personal friend of the Prime Minister, who was profoundly upset, indeed outraged, and in a speech in the House of Commons used harsh and menacing words about the Zionist use of terrorist methods. The Cabinet Committee, I believe, continued to discuss partition schemes. But the Prime Minister, only the Prime Minister could have put through a radical new plan. But Mr. Churchill seemed personally alienated by Moyne's assassination, refused to see Weizmann, and wholly averted his gaze from the entire issue. Nothing, he told Weizmann some months later, in 1945, nothing was to be decided until the war was over. No statement, no hint of things to come was to be given. This was unusually harsh and quite new, quite a new tone. The entire issue, for the time being, so far as Churchill was concerned, was dead. This seemed to me to be the critical turning point in the entire story. In addition to this, without this, I think perhaps partition might have been put through in 45. In addition to this, shortly after the meeting at Yalta, where Palestine seemed to have been but lightly touched on between Roosevelt and Stalin, and no minute of the discussion made, Roosevelt met King Ibn Saud and was profoundly impressed by him. He declared he'd learned more about Palestine from this brief encounter than during the previous years. He was alleged to have made pro-Zionist remarks to Stephen Wise even after this, and political exigencies might have made so mercurial a personality change his mind, or at least his word again, or at least pretend that he'd done so. Yet one member of his intimate entourage, whom I knew very well, made it absolutely clear that this conversation with the Arab king had really turned Roosevelt in a very anti-Zionist direction. If ever the Zionists had had a backer in him, they'd lost him then. With Churchill's withdrawal and Roosevelt in an Arabizing mood, Zionist prospects declined precipitously. Soon after this, President Roosevelt died. A few months later, after the San Francisco conference, where no decisions about Zionism were reached, Mr. Churchill lost the British elections. Zionist hopes for even more support from the Labour Party, the platform of which contained a super Zionist flank, whereas we all know, swiftly and cruelly dispelled. Mr. Attlee had, in his uncommunicative way, been stonily anti-Zionist for many years, although this had not become clear until he was in power. Bevin had become increasingly infuriated by Zionist claims and attitudes. Cripps was no friend. Dalton thought about other things. There was no one in the Labour cabinet willing or able to stand up to these powerful figures. Even if Roosevelt had lived, it seemed wholly improbable that he would have pressed the issue against so sharp a mood in London. At most, he might have sought escape, as so often, in vague generalities, and done his skillful best to keep the American Jews from boiling over. Zionism grew to be the only cause, the appeal of which rivaled that of Mr. Roosevelt's personality in the minds and hearts of American Jews. If he had shown real reluctance to support Zionist aspirations, this would have disturbed Jewish sentiment and perhaps produced a deep cleavage in the American Jewish community. In addition to this, three further phenomena seem to me to have changed the course of events. The first was the experience of those who saw the death camps in Germany and Poland, Dachau or Belsen or Ossentim. The impression made upon them was terrible beyond description. Statistics of the murdered Jews, then accumulating, appalled fellow Jews, but they took time to sink into the conscience of mankind. It was difficult to believe that this could be so. And with 20 or more million Russians dead, and who knew how many others on both sides of the war, it wasn't figures that most deeply devastated the imagination of the world, but the physical sight of the dead and the dying in the camps, the photographs and the films of the skeletons and the emaciated corpses, the children with the swollen bellies, and the pitiful heaps of broken human possessions. A vast wave of horror and compassion and outraged human feeling spread over the earth. This went, if anything, deeper than even the emotion caused by the martyrdom of the men and women in the resistance movement who had been tortured and killed. Sympathy for refugees, for displaced persons, above all for Jews, for their desperate search for a permanent home from which they could not be driven like cattle or exterminated by the hostile populations in the midst of which they lived, indignation on their behalf and warm-hearted feeling towards them sprang up everywhere, most strongly among the inhabitants of what had been Nazi-occupied Europe, scarcely less powerfully in America and elsewhere. It passed Mr. Bevin and his officials by, but it changed the temper of British opinion for a while. The rejection by the British government of the recommendations on immigration of the Anglo-American Commission of 45-46 disappointed liberals. Bevin's ill-concealed suspicion that Mr. Truman's support for it sprang from cynical motives irritated the President. Illegal Jewish immigration was helped in France and Italy and elsewhere by many Gentile sympathizers out of a simple sense of solidarity with the victims of bullies and oppressors. Mr. Bevin and his advisors overplayed their hand, grossly overplayed their hand, and provoked a reaction against our policies which less brutal behavior might have avoided. The episode of the Exodus caused worldwide indignation, but the decision to return the refugees to Germany was only the most notorious expression of a consistent attitude, and it played its part in the events that led to the decision of the United Nations in 1948. The Foreign Office gravely underestimated the force and the content of outraged liberal feeling in these post-war years. The Arab case did not go by default. Arab representatives protested with late success and in the capitals of the world. But the wrongs of the Jews, and above all on the immigration issue, dwarfed all others. The death camps, Mr. Bevin's ham-fisted anti-Zionism, were two among the unpredicted and novel features that altered the situation. To these must be added the rise of Jewish terrorism in Palestine itself. Liberal democracies, unlike tyrannies, by their very nature, cannot generate continuous counter-frightfulness for any length of time, at least independent territories. So it was in Palestine, in Cyprus, in Kenya, in Batavia, in Algiers. The sense of nightmare induced by the campaign of the Irgun and the Sternists, and even the Haganah, was clearly a real, even if not the decisive factor, in the British decision to abandon Palestine. Let me remind you again of the new situation. With Churchill antagonized by the assassination of Moyne, the British Cabinet committed partition scheme was shelved for the end of the war. Churchill fell from power. Terrorism in Palestine enormously diminished chances of cooperation. The horror of the Nazi death camps transformed American and world opinion. Messrs. Attlee and Bevin adopted the white paper policy in its entirety, and by making Arab consent a necessary condition, shut all doors to the Jews. This radicalized the Zionist moderates overnight. By 1947, we were all at one. Weizmann and Silva, Frankfurter and Emanuel Neumann, Goldman and Ben-Gurion, those to the left and to the right of us. Indeed, every Jew with the faintest sympathy for Zionism, all were molded into a united whole. The Labour government's flat rejection in 1946 of the American proposal to admit 100,000 refugees into Palestine made total resistance to its policies unavoidable. The Jewish Samson, in his agony, might have no alternative but to bring the entire temple of the Philistines crashing down upon himself and his persecutors. Weizmann, I remember, said this to me in a state of bitter despair. It may be, as Montesquieu once said, that without the operation of general causes, small ones can't generate great changes. But equally, these contingent small causes, when conditions are right, can lead to enormous upheavals. I know of no one who, say, in 1944, could have predicted the roles played by Ernest Bevin and Harry Truman in the birth of the State of Israel. Without Bevin's pig-headed obstinacy, Truman's personal goodwill, and the political miscalculations of all our chief advisors, things might have turned out very differently. This, indeed, is the central moral of my entire tale. Everyone now knows that it was President Truman who saved the Jewish cause. Votes may have something to do with Mr. Truman's decision, but the fact that he started without any apparent sympathy for Zionism, held back for so long, and acted so late in the day, speaks against the hypothesis that it was really the need for the Jewish votes that swayed his mind. Mr. Truman's capacity for swift decision and freedom from his great predecessor's inclination to be all things to all men showed themselves throughout his life. In his activity as head of the Wartime Truman Committee, in his swift decisions about the atom bomb, the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the recall of General MacArthur, Truman made up his mind about what he considered the right course to follow and then acted without hesitation. On the Palestine issue, he evidently decided that the Earl Doctor, as he called Weizmann, the Earl Doctor had more justice on his side than his opponents. He thought him right about the Jewish state, right about the Negev, about what the Jews were, and about what the Jews needed. This turned the scale. The new president conceived the genuine admiration of the old leader of the Zionist movement and supported him against the advice of most of his own officials. It was the last great service, perhaps in its own way as great as that 30 years earlier, that Weizmann was able to render to his people by the use of the method he understood best. By this time, another of my most skeptical and strongest beliefs was falsified by the facts. The Jewish population in the United States proved stronger, more united, and more courageous than I dared to believe. Wartime Zionist propaganda may not have made a significant impact on general American opinion, but it did put heart into the Jews of America. Consequently, they remained unshaken by the opposition of powerful American political leaders, by James Forrestal, for example, or to a lesser degree General Marshall or Dean Acheson. About this, Ben-Gurion's instinct proved sound. It was mass enthusiasm in America and the discipline and the strength of the Yishuv itself, not the British connection, in which I had so strongly believed, that were decisive in the creation of the mood in which Palestine commissions were set up, Britain reappraised its strategic position and abandoned Palestine, the United Nations vote took place, and the war of 1948 was won. And yet, if Moyne had not been killed, if Churchill continued in power after the war had ended, if a new British plan acceptable to the Zionists, at least the Weizmann and the Centre, had been implemented in 1945, if the British Commonwealth had put the umbrella over the new state, would the Arab states have attacked the victorious Britain? Would the Irgun have attempted a civil war, and would not Ben-Gurion have averted it? Might not such a development have saved much blood, prevented much bitterness, and above all, the conditions of beleaguerment in which the State of Israel has led its entire existence? Alternatively, it may be asked whether this could have occurred. Would Ben-Gurion have played the part? Would Ben-Gurion have played the part of De Valera to Weizmann's Griffiths, Mazzini to Weizmann's Cavour, only with greater success? Must the Moses always be followed by Joshua? I don't know. Nor do I know whether the State of Israel would have come into existence if Mr. Attlee had accepted the recommendations of the Anglo-American Commission of 1946, or whether, if it had, it could have developed an association with the British Commonwealth. Even if the ties had been loose, this would still have involved the surrender of independent defense and financial and foreign policies. Could this have lasted? Would this have ended without revolt? And if it had, would the Arabs have acquiesced in this British act, as Weizmann certainly used to believe? Can a nation be created, or in this case, in the words of Moses Hess, rise from the grave by the bounty of others? I don't know. I simply don't know. These are the thoughts, some of which passed through my head when I considered these various matters. I simply thought that I would simply tell you about the kinds of things which occurred and about the extraordinary fact that these things could not have been predicted at the time, because in the end we don't know what happened or how it happened. These are the kind of issues, particularly the would-have-beens of the war and of the situation during the war, which we often used to discuss, Ya'akov Herzog and I. We often used to discuss whether, in fact, it was possible to suppose that very small things could have averted the very great events which had occurred. I remember that we used to meet quite often and discuss these things, discuss both what had happened and what would have happened. Sometimes we used to discuss it alone, sometimes we used to discuss it with our friend, the late Zalman Aran, and then after he died, we used to discuss it alone with great love and affection for Aran. And now, Ya'akov Herzog too has passed away, and I alone am left to mourn him. I think that he was a man to whom I was drawn by the deepest bonds of friendship. And I cannot without the deepest distress think of this particular subject which I've spoken to without remembering that these were the very topics which towards the end of his life I used to discuss with my friend Ya'akov Herzog, Zchrono. As long as I live, I should mourn his memory. Thank you very much. The people are missing,
Sir Isaiah, I would like to express to you on behalf of everyone in this audience and those who will have the opportunity of reading your lecture, which will shortly be published, our deepest appreciation to you for what you have spoken to us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you kindly to remain in your places while the President of Israel and the Prime Minister of Israel leave us. Thank you. Come down here to be greeted by them, Azan.